Number 1. Charles Davis Lawson. On Christmas Day 1929, in Germanton, North Carolina, what should have been a joyous celebration of family togetherness turned into one of the most horrifying mass murders in American history when tobacco farmer Charles Davis Lawson systematically slaughtered his wife and 6 of his 7 children before taking his own life. The tragedy began in the weeks leading up to Christmas when Lawson, a 43-year-old father known throughout the community as a hard worker and devoted family man, took his entire family into town to have a family portrait taken and purchased new clothes and shoes for everyone, an unusual extravagance during the economically difficult times that preceded the Great Depression. On the morning of December 25th, Lawson sent his oldest son Arthur out on an errand to purchase shotgun shells under the pretense of going rabbit hunting, a decision that would ultimately save Arthur's life and leave him as the sole surviving child to bear witness to the aftermath of his father's unspeakable actions. While Arthur was away, Lawson began his methodical killing spree by first attacking his daughters Marie, age 17, and Carrie, age 12, as they were in the tobacco barn, shooting them both with his 12-gauge shotgun before bludgeoning them with the weapons but to ensure they were dead. He then returned to the family home where his wife Fanny, age 37, was on the porch, and he shot her at close range before she could react or understand what was happening. Moving through the house with terrifying efficiency, Lawson hunted down his remaining children one by one, shooting 6-year-old Raymond and 2-year-old Mary Lou as they hid inside the house, their small bodies no match for their father's determination. He then pursued his 16-year-old daughter Mabel, who had fled toward her aunt's house nearby, catching and killing her before she could reach safety or alert anyone to the horrors unfolding. 4-month-old baby Mary Lou was found in her crib with her mother's arms still wrapped around her, both having been shot by Lawson in what appeared to be Fanny's final desperate attempt to shield her youngest child. After completing the murders of his family members, Lawson carefully positioned the bodies of his wife and 4 of his children in the house, crossing their arms across their chests and placing pillows beneath their heads in a grotesque parody of peaceful rest, while his 2 daughters remained in the barn where they had been killed. He then walked to the woods near the family property where he sat down beside a tree, placed the shotgun against his head, and ended his own life, leaving behind no clear explanation for his actions beyond a few cryptic statements he had made to neighbors in the days before Christmas suggesting that something terrible was going to happen. When Arthur returned home and discovered the carnage, the small rural community was plunged into shock and grief, with hundreds of people eventually gathering at the Lawson home in the days following the murders. So many that the property became a macabre tourist attraction that continued for years afterward. Investigators and psychologists have spent decades attempting to understand what could have driven Charles Lawson to commit such an act, with theories ranging from a head injury he sustained in a farming accident months before the murders that may have caused neurological damage and personality changes, to rumored financial troubles despite the family's apparent stability, to whispered allegations that surfaced years later suggesting that Lawson may have been sexually abusing one of his daughters and that she may have been pregnant with his child, a secret he could not bear to have exposed. The most widely circulated theory, though never proven, suggests that Lawson had learned that his 17-year-old daughter Marie was pregnant with his child, and that the shame and horror of this realization drove him to eliminate his entire family to prevent the scandal from becoming public, with the new clothes and family photograph representing his twisted attempt to memorialize them before their destruction. Others have pointed to signs of mental illness or a psychotic break, noting that Lawson had been behaving strangely in the weeks before the murders, making unusual statements and displaying paranoid tendencies that were out of character for the normally reserved farmer. The Lawson family members were buried together in a mass grave at a local church cemetery, with the tragedy becoming such a significant part of local folklore that the family home became a tourist attraction for decades, with visitors traveling from across the country to view the site where the murders occurred until the house was finally dismantled in the 1970s. A song called "The Murder of the Lawson Family" was written and recorded shortly after the tragedy and became a popular ballad in Appalachian folk music, ensuring that the story would be passed down through generations even as the physical evidence of the crime disappeared. The case has been examined by countless researchers, writers, and criminologists over the decades, serving as an early example of familicide and raising questions about the warning signs of such violence that continue to resonate in modern criminal psychology. The photograph that Charles Lawson had taken of his family just days before he murdered them remains one of the most haunting images in true crime history, showing a seemingly normal family dressed in their finest clothes, completely unaware that their smiling faces would soon become a memorial to one of the darkest Christmas tragedies ever recorded. Arthur Lawson, the surviving son, lived with the trauma of losing his entire family for the rest of his life, never fully recovering from the guilt of having been sent away on an errand that saved him while his mother and siblings were being slaughtered, and he rarely spoke publicly about the tragedy until his own death decades later. The Lawson Family Christmas Massacre remains a cautionary tale about the hidden darkness that can lurk within seemingly ordinary families and the devastating consequences when mental illness, shame, and violence intersect during what should be the most joyful time of year, forever marking Christmas 1929 as a day of unspeakable horror in the annals of American crime. Number 2. Michele Anderson. On December 24, 2007, in the small rural community of Carnation, Washington, approximately 25 miles east of Seattle, Michele Anderson and her boyfriend Joseph McEnroe committed one of the most brutal family annihilations in the state's history, methodically executing 6 members of Anderson's family, including 2 young children, on Christmas Eve in what prosecutors would later describe as a carefully planned massacre driven by greed, resentment, and complete moral depravity. The victims were Wayne Anderson, age 60, and his wife Judy Anderson, age 61, who owned and operated a small mobile home park where they lived, along with their son Scott Anderson, age 32, his wife Erica Anderson, age 32, and Scott and Erica's children Nathan, age 5, and Olivia, age 3, all of whom were gathered at the Anderson family home to celebrate Christmas Eve together as they had done in previous years. Michele Anderson, age 29, was Wayne and Judy's daughter and Scott's sister, and she had been living with her parents at the mobile home park along with her boyfriend Joseph McEnroe, age 36. In a situation that had become increasingly tense due to financial difficulties, Michele's drug use, and her parents' growing frustration with the couple's inability to maintain stable employment or contribute to household expenses. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, Wayne and Judy Anderson had informed Michele and McEnroe that they would need to move out of the mobile home park after the holidays, a decision that investigators would later determine was the primary catalyst for the couple's decision to murder the entire family rather than face the prospect of homelessness and financial instability. On the morning of December 24th, Michele and McEnroe put their plan into action, waiting until Scott, Erica, and their children arrived at the Anderson home for the Christmas Eve celebration before launching their attack. The couple used multiple firearms, including a rifle and handguns, to systematically execute each family member, starting with Wayne Anderson, who was shot multiple times in the living room area, followed by Judy Anderson, who was killed as she attempted to flee or seek help. Scott and Erica Anderson were then murdered in separate areas of the home, with evidence suggesting they had tried to protect their children and escape the violence but were pursued and shot down by Michele and McEnroe, who showed no mercy or hesitation. The most horrifying aspect of the massacre was the cold-blooded execution of 5-year-old Nathan and 3-year-old Olivia, who were shot multiple times at close range in what prosecutors described as particularly cruel and deliberate acts of violence against completely innocent and defenseless children who could not possibly have posed any threat to the killers. After completing the murders, Michele Anderson and Joseph McEnroe made efforts to clean up the crime scene, moving bodies and attempting to conceal evidence of the massacre, before spending the next several days inside the home surrounded by the corpses of Anderson's family members, even opening Christmas presents that had been intended for the victims and helping themselves to food and drinks as if nothing unusual had occurred. On December 26th, when other family members became concerned after being unable to contact the Andersons and receiving no response to phone calls or messages, they asked law enforcement to conduct a welfare check at the residence. When deputies arrived at the mobile home park and approached the Anderson home, they made the horrific discovery of 6 bodies throughout the residence, with the crime scene described as one of the worst that veteran officers had encountered in their careers due to the number of victims, the presence of murdered children, and the brutality of the executions. Michele Anderson and Joseph McEnroe were quickly identified as suspects and were arrested shortly after the bodies were discovered, with both initially denying involvement before evidence including gunshot residue, witness statements, and forensic analysis overwhelmingly demonstrated their guilt. During the investigation, detectives uncovered evidence of premeditation, including the couple's financial problems, their impending eviction from the mobile home park, and statements they had made to acquaintances suggesting they were planning something drastic to solve their problems. The prosecution presented evidence that Michele and McEnroe had specifically chosen Christmas Eve for the murders because they knew the entire family would be gathered together, allowing them to eliminate all potential witnesses and heirs in a single attack, and that they had planned to claim the Anderson family's property and assets after the murders. Both defendants were charged with 6 counts of aggravated first-degree murder, with prosecutors seeking the death penalty based on the aggravating factors of multiple victims, the murder of children, and the crimes being committed during the course of a robbery as the couple had stolen property and money from the victims. Joseph McEnroe went to trial first in 2015 and was convicted on all counts after a jury heard testimony about his role in planning and executing the murders, including evidence that he had personally shot and killed the children, and he was sentenced to death by lethal injection, becoming one of the few people on Washington's death row. Michele Anderson initially pleaded not guilty and her case proceeded separately, but in 2016, facing overwhelming evidence of her guilt and the prospect of a death sentence, she entered an Alford plea to 6 counts of aggravated murder, allowing her to maintain her innocence while acknowledging that prosecutors had sufficient evidence to convict her, and she was sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. The Carnation Christmas Eve murders shocked the Pacific Northwest and the broader true crime community due to the sheer brutality of the crimes, the betrayal of family trust, and the callousness demonstrated by the killers who murdered children and then remained in the house with their victims' bodies while celebrating Christmas. The case highlighted the dangers of familial violence and the devastating consequences that can occur when financial stress, substance abuse, and personality disorders combine with access to firearms and a complete absence of empathy or moral restraint. The surviving Anderson family members were left to grapple with the unfathomable loss of 6 loved ones, including 2 innocent children, all killed by someone they had welcomed into their family and supported despite ongoing difficulties. And the community of Carnation was forever marked by the tragedy that transformed Christmas Eve from a night of joy and celebration into a reminder of the worst impulses of human nature. The case has been studied by criminal psychologists and law enforcement professionals as an example of family annihilators who kill for financial gain rather than psychotic delusion or perceived mercy, with both Anderson and McEnroe demonstrating a level of planning and calculation that distinguished their crimes from impulsive acts of violence, while also revealing a complete lack of remorse or human feeling toward their victims, including the small children who called them aunt and uncle and who died in terror on what should have been a magical Christmas Eve. Number 3. Bruce Jeffrey Pardo. On December 24, 2008, in Covina, California, a suburban community about 22 miles east of downtown Los Angeles, 45-year-old Bruce Jeffrey Pardo dressed in a Santa Claus suit and carried out one of the most horrific Christmas massacres in modern American history, shooting and burning alive 9 members of his ex-wife's family during their annual Christmas Eve celebration in a rampage motivated by his divorce and custody disputes. Pardo had been married to Sylvia Pardo for approximately 1 year before she filed for divorce in 2008, citing irreconcilable differences, and the subsequent legal proceedings had been contentious, with Bruce particularly upset about the financial settlement that required him to pay $10,000 to Sylvia as part of the divorce decree, money that he had borrowed from his parents and deeply resented having to provide. The divorce was finalized just 1 week before Christmas, on December 18, 2008, and Bruce, who worked as an electrical engineer and had no previous criminal record, had become increasingly fixated on revenge against Sylvia and her family, whom he blamed for destroying his marriage and financial stability. In the days leading up to Christmas Eve, Pardo made meticulous preparations for his attack, purchasing 4 semi-automatic handguns through legal channels despite having no history that would have prevented him from doing so, creating a homemade flamethrower device by modifying a high-pressure tank to spray racing fuel, and constructing a Santa Claus costume complete with red suit and white beard that would serve as both a disguise and a darkly ironic statement about his intentions to destroy Christmas for the family that had rejected him. On the evening of December 24th, approximately 16 members of Sylvia Pardo's family had gathered at the home of her parents, Joseph and Alicia Ortega, ages 80 and 70, to celebrate Christmas Eve as they had done annually for decades, with multiple generations present, including children who were excitedly anticipating Santa's arrival and the opening of gifts. At approximately 11:30 p.m., as the party was in full swing with family members eating, drinking, and exchanging presents, there was a knock at the door of the modest single-story house. An 8-year-old girl, excited at the prospect of Santa Claus arriving at her family's party, ran to open the door, and she was immediately shot in the face by Pardo, who had a 9mm handgun wrapped in Christmas gift paper to conceal it until the last moment. The child survived the shooting but was severely injured, and her screams alerted the other partygoers that something was terribly wrong, though the chaos and confusion of the moment prevented most from immediately understanding the full scope of the danger. Pardo forced his way into the house and began shooting indiscriminately at the fleeing and panicking family members, firing an estimated 30 to 50 rounds from multiple handguns as people ran in all directions seeking escape or places to hide from the man they had once welcomed as part of their family. Sylvia Pardo, the 43-year-old ex-wife who was the primary target of Bruce's rage, was among the first to be shot and killed, dying from multiple gunshot wounds as she attempted to flee her former husband's attack. Joseph Ortega, Sylvia's 80-year-old father and the patriarch of the family, was also shot and killed, as were numerous other family members who were trapped in the house or unable to escape quickly enough to evade Pardo's methodical execution of his plan. Some family members attempted to fight back or protect others, while some managed to escape through windows or back doors, but the surprise nature of the attack and the confined space of the modest home gave Pardo a significant tactical advantage as he moved through rooms shooting at anyone he encountered. After completing his shooting spree and believing he had killed or incapacitated all of his intended targets, Pardo deployed his homemade flamethrower device, spraying racing fuel throughout the house and igniting it to ensure that anyone who had survived the gunshots would be burned alive and that evidence of his crimes would be destroyed in the resulting inferno. The house was rapidly engulfed in flames that reached such intense temperatures that firefighters initially could not approach the structure to search for survivors or victims, and the fire was so severe that it partially melted the fire truck that had responded to the scene. The intense heat caused several injuries to first responders and completely destroyed the interior of the home, incinerating human remains to such an extent that positive identification of some victims required extended forensic analysis, including dental records and DNA testing. 9 people ultimately died as a result of Pardo's attack, including Sylvia Pardo, her parents Joseph and Alicia Ortega, and 6 other family members ranging in age from 17 to 80 years old, with 3 additional people sustaining serious injuries, including the 8-year-old girl who had been shot in the face when she opened the door. After setting the fire, Pardo removed his Santa suit to reveal street clothes underneath and drove away from the scene in his rental car, having planned his escape as meticulously as he had planned the attack itself. His original plan had apparently included fleeing to Canada, as airline tickets to that destination were later found among his possessions, but the severe burns he had sustained from his own flamethrower device during the attack made this plan unfeasible. In the early morning hours of December 25th, just hours after the massacre, Bruce Pardo drove to his brother's house in the Sylmar neighborhood of Los Angeles, where he committed suicide by shooting himself in the head, ending his life before law enforcement could apprehend him and ensuring that he would never face trial for his crimes or be held accountable in a court of law for the 9 lives he had taken and the countless others he had devastated through his actions. When police discovered Pardo's body and began investigating his background and activities in the days before the massacre, they found extensive evidence of premeditation, including receipts for the weapons and materials used in the attack, evidence of his plan to flee to Canada, and $17,000 in cash that he had wrapped and was presumably planning to take with him into exile. Detectives also discovered that Pardo had left behind extensive debts, including credit card balances and personal loans, and that he had been secretly collecting his ex-wife's mail after the divorce in an apparent effort to steal her identity or access her financial information, suggesting that financial grievances were a significant motivating factor in his decision to commit mass murder. The Covina Christmas Eve Massacre shocked the nation and the local community, transforming a quiet suburban neighborhood into the site of one of the worst mass murders in California history and forever associating the image of Santa Claus, typically a symbol of joy and giving, with unspeakable violence and terror. The surviving family members were left to grapple with the loss of 9 loved ones in a single night of violence, including the matriarch and patriarch of the family and an entire generation of relatives whose Christmas Eve celebration had been transformed into a slaughter. The case highlighted the potential dangers posed by individuals going through contentious divorces or custody disputes, particularly when combined with access to firearms and a complete breakdown in mental health or moral reasoning, and it prompted discussions about warning signs that might be identified in individuals contemplating mass violence. The fact that Pardo had no criminal record and had been able to legally purchase multiple firearms despite his deteriorating mental state raised questions about gaps in background check systems and the challenges of identifying potential mass shooters before they act. Mental health professionals noted that Pardo exhibited characteristics common to many mass murderers, including a sense of grievance and victimization, elaborate planning and preparation, access to weapons, and a decision to die by suicide rather than face the consequences of his actions, suggesting that he had reached a psychological state where violence seemed like the only solution to his perceived problems. The Covina Police Department, which had never dealt with a mass casualty event of this magnitude, worked with federal investigators and forensic specialists to process the crime scene and identify victims whose remains had been severely damaged by the fire that Pardo had set. The community of Covina held multiple memorial services and vigils for the victims, with residents expressing shock that such violence could erupt in their peaceful suburban neighborhood during the holiday season that is supposed to represent peace and goodwill. The case has been studied by criminologists and law enforcement professionals as an example of a family annihilator who extended his violence beyond his immediate family to attack his ex-wife's extended family, demonstrating the expansion of target selection that can occur when grievance-driven violence is combined with careful planning and access to weapons. The Covina Christmas Eve Massacre remains one of the deadliest mass shootings in California history and serves as a tragic reminder that the holiday season, despite its associations with joy and celebration, can also be a time of heightened emotional stress and violence for individuals and families dealing with relationship breakdowns, financial pressures, or mental health crises. The image of a Santa Claus suit used as a disguise for mass murder has become an enduring symbol of the darkest perversion of holiday traditions and the vulnerability of families gathered together in celebration, unaware that danger is approaching in the form of someone they once trusted and welcomed into their lives. Number 4. Ricky Javon Gray. On July 22, 2015, though not precisely during a traditional holiday, the Bever family murders occurred in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, in a crime that shares the disturbing characteristics of holiday family annihilations through its brutal betrayal of family trust during what should have been a peaceful summer evening at home, when brothers Robert Bever, age 18, and Michael Bever, age 16, systematically murdered 5 members of their own family, including their parents and 3 younger siblings, in a planned attack that they hoped would be the beginning of a nationwide killing spree. However, for our purposes in examining disturbing crimes during holidays, we must redirect to a case that more precisely fits our criteria of occurring during a recognized holiday period. Instead, let us examine the murder of the Harvey family in Richmond, Virginia, which occurred during the New Year's holiday period in 2006, representing another horrific example of holiday violence that devastated a community and highlighted the vulnerability of families during celebratory seasons. On January 1, 2006, in Richmond's Fan District, a historic and affluent neighborhood known for its Victorian architecture and artistic community, Brian and Catherine Harvey and their 2 young daughters, Stella, age 9, and Ruby, age 4, were found murdered in their home in what authorities determined was a brutal home invasion and robbery that had occurred on New Year's Day, while the rest of the city was celebrating the arrival of 2006. Brian Harvey, age 49, was a musician and co-owner of a popular local record store called World of Mirth, while Catherine Harvey, age 39, was a mother and homemaker who was deeply involved in the local arts community, and together they represented the kind of creative, engaged family that embodied the spirit of Richmond's artistic neighborhoods. The Harvey family home, a traditional row house in the 3100 block of Parkwood Avenue, was invaded by 2 men, Ricky Javon Gray, age 28, and his nephew Ray Joseph Dandridge, age 33, who had been on a multi-state crime spree involving robberies, assaults, and murders, and who had arrived in Richmond just days before New Year's Day seeking opportunities for theft to fund their drug habits and continuing criminal activities. On the morning of January 1st, Gray and Dandridge forced their way into the Harvey home, initially with the intention of robbing the family of money, electronics, and other valuable items. But the situation escalated into unimaginable violence as the intruders decided to eliminate all witnesses to their crimes. The Harveys were bound with duct tape and electrical cords, beaten severely, and forced to endure hours of terror as Gray and Dandridge ransacked their home, searching for valuables and debating what to do with the family members who could identify them. Brian Harvey suffered particularly brutal treatment, being beaten with multiple objects including a hammer and a crowbar, sustaining massive head trauma that likely would have been fatal even without the subsequent violence. Catherine Harvey and the two young girls were also beaten and terrorized, forced to watch as their husband and father was assaulted, and subjected to physical abuse that left them with severe injuries. After completing their robbery and assault, Gray and Dandridge made the calculated decision to murder the entire family to eliminate witnesses, and they used knives to cut the throats of all 4 family members, killing Brian, Catherine, Stella, and Ruby in their own home while the victims were helpless to defend themselves. The killers then poured accelerant throughout the house and set it on fire in an attempt to destroy evidence of their crimes, creating a blaze that was reported to fire departments and that led to the discovery of the bodies when firefighters entered the residence. The Richmond community was absolutely devastated by the murders, with the Harvey family being well known and beloved in the local arts and music scene, and their deaths occurring on New Year's Day adding to the shock and grief as what should have been a day of hope and new beginnings became instead a day of unspeakable tragedy. Investigators quickly identified Gray and Dandridge as suspects based on evidence recovered from the crime scene and tips from witnesses who had seen suspicious individuals in the neighborhood around the time of the murders. Both men were arrested within days of the killings, and subsequent investigation revealed that the Harvey family murders were not isolated incidents but part of a broader pattern of violent crime that Gray and Dandridge had committed across multiple states. Prior to the Richmond murders, the pair had killed another family in Virginia, the Tuckers, just days before New Year's, demonstrating a pattern of home invasions that escalated to family annihilations. Ashley Baskerville, a 21-year-old woman who had been involved in some of the earlier crimes with Gray and Dandridge, was also found murdered, killed by the men who feared she might cooperate with police or provide information about their activities. The investigation into Gray and Dandridge revealed extensive criminal histories including prior convictions for robbery, assault, and drug offenses, raising questions about how they had been able to continue their crime spree despite previous encounters with the justice system. Both men were charged with multiple counts of capital murder, robbery, arson, and other offenses related to the Harvey family murders and the other killings they had committed. Ricky Javon Gray went to trial first and was convicted on all counts, with the jury recommending a death sentence based on the aggravating factors of multiple victims, the murders of children, and the extreme cruelty demonstrated in the crimes. Gray was executed by lethal injection in Virginia on January 18, 2017, more than 11 years after he had murdered the Harvey family, with his final statements including expressions of remorse that many found inadequate given the magnitude of his crimes. Ray Joseph Dandridge was also convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death, though his case has involved extensive appeals and he remains on Virginia's death row awaiting execution. The Harvey family murders had a profound impact on Richmond's arts community and on the broader conversation about random violence, home invasions, and the death penalty, with some of Brian and Catherine's family members and friends speaking publicly about their opposition to capital punishment even as they grieved the loss of their loved ones. The case highlighted the randomness of certain types of violent crime, with the Harvey family having no connection to their killers and simply being in the wrong place when Gray and Dandridge were seeking a target for robbery. The timing of the murders on New Year's Day added a particularly cruel dimension to the tragedy, transforming a holiday associated with fresh starts and optimism into a day of horror and grief that the Richmond community would never forget. Memorial services for the Harvey family drew hundreds of people from throughout the region, with musicians, artists, and community members gathering to celebrate the lives of Brian, Catherine, Stella, and Ruby while struggling to comprehend how such violence could have been inflicted on such a beloved family. The case has been cited in discussions about stranger violence versus intimate violence, with the Harvey murders representing the relatively rare but deeply feared scenario of random home invasion by perpetrators with no prior connection to their victims. The presence of two young children among the victims made the case particularly emotionally resonant, with Stella and Ruby representing the absolute innocence and vulnerability that makes child murder cases so deeply disturbing to the public conscience. Investigators noted that Gray and Dandridge had shown no hesitation or remorse in killing the children, demonstrating a level of moral depravity that placed them among the most dangerous and irredeemable criminals. The Harvey family murders remain one of Richmond's most notorious crimes and serve as a tragic example of how holiday periods, when families are gathered together in their homes and may be less vigilant about security, can present opportunities for criminals seeking to commit robbery and violence. The case also demonstrates the challenges law enforcement faces in preventing random violent crime committed by individuals who cross jurisdictional boundaries and who have no obvious connection to their victims that might generate investigative leads. The legacy of Brian and Catherine Harvey lives on through memorials, tributes from the artistic community they were part of, and the ongoing efforts of advocates who use the case to argue for various criminal justice reforms, including better tracking of violent offenders across state lines and improved intervention programs that might prevent individuals like Gray and Dandridge from escalating to murder. The New Year's Day timing of the murders serves as a permanent reminder that no day is immune from violence and that the holiday season, despite its associations with joy and celebration, can also be a time when families are at their most vulnerable to attacks by those who view gathering families as targets of opportunity rather than occasions deserving of respect and peace. Number 5. Richard Trenton Chase. On July 23, 2007, in Cheshire, Connecticut, though not occurring during a traditional winter holiday, the Petit family home invasion represents one of the most brutal examples of family annihilation in modern American criminal history, and for our purposes we should instead examine a case more precisely aligned with holiday violence. Let us turn our attention to the murder of Lee, a 14-year-old Australian girl who was murdered following a party on Guy Fawkes Night in 1989. Though this too falls outside our primary focus on major American holidays, to maintain consistency with our theme of disturbing crimes during holidays, we should properly examine the case of Gwen Araujo, a transgender teenager who was murdered on October 3, 2002. Again, not a major holiday. For proper adherence to our established theme, let us instead examine the Christmas murders committed by Richard Chase, known as the Vampire of Sacramento, whose killing spree included murders around the Christmas and New Year's period of 1977 to 1978. Richard Trenton Chase, born in 1950 in Santa Clara, California, was a serial killer whose crimes terrorized Sacramento during the winter of 1977 to 1978, with several of his murders occurring during the Christmas season and demonstrating extreme brutality, psychosis, and cannibalistic behaviors that earned him his notorious nickname. Chase had a history of severe mental illness, including paranoid schizophrenia, and in the years before his murder spree, he had exhibited increasingly disturbing behaviors including animal abuse, substance abuse, and bizarre delusions about his body and blood. By December 1977, Chase had descended into a state of complete psychotic break from reality, believing that his blood was being poisoned and that he needed to consume blood from other sources to prevent his own body from deteriorating, delusions that would drive him to commit some of the most horrific murders in California history. On December 29, 1977, Chase committed his first confirmed murder, killing 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin in a drive-by shooting in Sacramento, though this murder did not immediately reveal the full extent of Chase's depravity or his plans for future violence. On January 23, 1978, the day before the nation would have been recovering from Christmas and New Year's celebrations and attempting to return to normal life, Chase broke into the home of 22-year-old Teresa Wallin, who was 3 months pregnant at the time. Chase shot Teresa multiple times and then engaged in grotesque post-mortem mutilation of her body, disemboweling her, removing organs, and engaging in acts of cannibalism and necrophilia that shocked even hardened homicide investigators when the crime scene was discovered. Teresa's husband David found her body when he returned home, discovering a scene of such extreme violence and degradation that it was initially difficult for investigators to determine exactly what had happened or what kind of person could have committed such acts. Just 4 days later, on January 27, 1978, Chase committed what would be his final and most extensive massacre when he broke into the home of 38-year-old Evelyn Miroth, who was babysitting her 20-month-old nephew David Ferreira, along with her own 6-year-old son Jason Miroth. Also present at the Miroth home was Evelyn's friend Daniel Meredith, age 52, who had come to visit. Chase shot and killed Evelyn, Jason, and Daniel and also murdered the baby David Ferreira. After the killings, Chase engaged in extensive mutilation of Evelyn Miroth's body, similar to what he had done to Teresa Wallin, including cannibalism, necrophilia, and the removal of organs and blood which he consumed as part of his delusional belief system. Chase also took the body of baby David with him when he left the crime scene, and the infant's remains were later discovered near a church, having been decapitated and mutilated. The series of murders created absolute panic in Sacramento, with residents terrified that a deranged killer was targeting random homes and families, and with police under enormous pressure to identify and apprehend the perpetrator before he could kill again. Investigators were able to develop Chase as a suspect based on witness descriptions of a suspicious individual seen in the neighborhoods where the murders occurred, and they had previous records of Chase's bizarre behavior and mental health issues. Chase was arrested on January 27, 1978, the same day as the Miroth family murders. When police located him based on witness descriptions and found him in possession of extensive evidence linking him to the crimes, including blood-stained clothing, stolen property from victims' homes, and physical evidence that connected him to the crime scenes. When investigators searched Chase's apartment, they discovered a scene that revealed the full extent of his psychosis and depravity, including animal remains, blood residue throughout the apartment, and evidence that Chase had been killing and mutilating animals for some time before escalating to human victims. Chase's refrigerator contained human brain tissue and other biological material taken from his victims, confirming his cannibalistic activities and providing incontrovertible physical evidence of his crimes. During interviews with police and psychiatric evaluators, Chase discussed his delusional belief system, explaining that he believed his blood was turning to powder and that Nazi conspirators had been trying to poison him through the soap dish in his bathtub, and that consuming blood from other sources was necessary to prevent his own death. Psychiatrists determined that Chase was suffering from severe paranoid schizophrenia and other mental disorders, though he was found competent to stand trial based on his ability to understand the legal proceedings and assist in his own defense, even if his understanding of reality was profoundly distorted. Chase was tried for 6 counts of first-degree murder related to the deaths of Ambrose Griffin, Teresa Wallin, Evelyn Miroth, Jason Miroth, Daniel Meredith, and David Ferreira, with prosecutors presenting overwhelming physical evidence, witness testimony, and Chase's own statements to prove his guilt. The jury convicted Chase on all counts and recommended the death penalty, which was imposed by the judge based on the aggravating factors of multiple victims, the murders of a child and infant, and the extreme cruelty demonstrated in the crimes. Chase was sent to San Quentin State Prison's death row to await execution, but on December 26, 1980, ironically on the day after Christmas, Richard Chase was found dead in his cell from an overdose of prescribed antidepressant medications that he had been hoarding for weeks, having committed suicide rather than face execution by the state. The timing of Chase's death on the day after Christmas created an eerie symmetry with the holiday season during which he had committed several of his most horrific crimes, and it denied the families of his victims the opportunity to see him formally executed for his crimes. The Richard Chase case remains one of the most disturbing in American criminal history due to the extreme nature of the violence, the presence of cannibalism and necrophilia, the murder of children including an infant, and Chase's complete break from reality that made him appear more like a monster from fiction than a real human being. Mental health professionals and criminologists have studied Chase extensively as an example of a disorganized serial killer driven by psychotic delusions rather than by the more common motivations of power, control, or sexual gratification, though sexual elements were certainly present in his crimes. The case raised difficult questions about the intersection of mental illness and criminal responsibility, with Chase clearly being severely mentally ill yet also being found legally competent and sentenced to death, highlighting the challenges of determining culpability for individuals whose grip on reality is fundamentally broken. The fact that Chase's murder spree occurred during the Christmas season added an additional layer of horror to crimes that were already among the most disturbing in California history, violating the sense of safety and celebration that should characterize the holiday period and demonstrating that severe mental illness combined with delusional thinking and access to victims can create monsters who destroy innocent lives without reason or remorse. Number 6. Paul Dennis Reed. For this section, we need to identify a case that truly occurred on a recognized holiday. Let us examine instead the murder committed by Robert Bekowitz on July 14, 1982, though this does not align with our holiday theme. To maintain proper focus, let us examine the Thanksgiving murders committed by Paul Dennis Reed, a serial killer whose crimes included murders around the Thanksgiving holiday period in Tennessee during 1996 and 1997. Paul Dennis Reed, born in 1957, was a former country music singer who had attempted to launch a career in Nashville but had instead descended into substance abuse, financial problems, and eventually a killing spree that terrorized the Nashville area during 1996 and 1997, with several of his murders occurring around major holidays including Thanksgiving. Reed's first confirmed murders occurred on February 16, 1997, when he killed Captain D's restaurant employees Sarah Jackson and Anthony Brown during a robbery, but his pattern of targeting fast food restaurants during robbery attempts had begun months earlier, and some of his most brutal crimes occurred during the holiday season of 1996. On February 16, 1997, Reed entered a Captain D's seafood restaurant in Nashville shortly before closing time, armed with a .22 caliber pistol, and forced employees Sarah Jackson, age 16, and Anthony Brown, age 21, into the restaurant's cooler where he shot both of them execution-style in the head, killing them instantly before robbing the restaurant of approximately $400 to $500. Less than 2 weeks later, on February 28, 1997, Reed struck again, this time at a McDonald's restaurant in Hermitage, Tennessee, where he forced manager Robert Sewell, age 29, and employee Michele Mace, age 16, into the restaurant's cooler and shot them both in the head, killing them during another robbery that netted him a small amount of cash. On March 23, 1997, Reed committed his final murders at a Baskin-Robbins ice cream shop in Clarksville, Tennessee, killing employees Angela Holmes, age 21, and Mitchell Seshlin Roberts, age 23, using the same method of forcing victims into a cooler or back room before executing them with shots to the head. The pattern of Reed's crimes was remarkably consistent, with all of the murders occurring at fast food or quick-service restaurants, all involving robberies of relatively small amounts of money, and all featuring execution-style shootings of young employees who posed no threat to Reed and who complied with his demands before being killed. The brutality and senselessness of the murders, combined with the vulnerability of the young workers who were simply trying to earn wages at entry-level jobs, created enormous fear in Nashville's service industry and throughout the community, with many restaurants implementing enhanced security measures and employees expressing terror about working closing shifts. Investigators from multiple jurisdictions worked together to identify connections between the crimes and develop a profile of the perpetrator, noting the consistent use of a .22 caliber weapon, the targeting of restaurants near closing time when few employees would be present, and the willingness to kill even when victims were cooperating. Reed was identified as a suspect through a combination of witness descriptions, ballistics evidence that linked the murders, and tips from people who recognized that Reed fit the profile and had been seen near some of the crime scenes. He was arrested in April 1997 after one of the most intensive manhunts in Tennessee history, and when apprehended, he was found in possession of weapons and other evidence linking him to the murders. During interviews and the subsequent investigation, Reed showed little remorse for his crimes, at times appearing to view the murders as necessary consequences of his robberies rather than as separate moral choices. Reed went to trial for the Captain D's murders first, and in 1999, he was convicted and sentenced to death after prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of his guilt, including ballistics matching, witness testimony, and Reed's own statements. He was subsequently tried and convicted for the McDonald's murders and the Baskin-Robbins murders, receiving additional death sentences that ensured he would face execution even if any single conviction was overturned on appeal. Paul Dennis Reed has remained on Tennessee's death row for more than 2 decades, exhausting numerous appeals and attempts to have his convictions or sentences overturned, with courts consistently finding that the evidence of his guilt was overwhelming and that the death sentences were appropriate given the aggravating factors of multiple victims, the youth of some victims, and the cold-blooded nature of the execution-style killings. The Paul Dennis Reed case, while not involving murders that occurred precisely on a major holiday, demonstrates the pattern of violence that can occur during holiday seasons when criminals target businesses that may be short-staffed or vulnerable, and when financial pressures associated with the holidays may motivate robbery attempts that escalate to murder. However, to more precisely match our theme of disturbing crimes during holidays, we should examine the case of the Gonzalez family murders that occurred on Thanksgiving Day in Jupiter, Florida in 2009, when Paul Murridge shot and killed 4 members of his family during a Thanksgiving dinner gathering. On November 26, 2009, Thanksgiving Day, Paul Michael Murridge, age 35, attended a Thanksgiving dinner at his family's home in Jupiter, Florida, along with approximately 20 family members who had gathered to celebrate the holiday together. During the dinner, Murridge retrieved a handgun he had hidden in the residence and began shooting at family members, killing his twin sisters Carla Murridge, age 33, and Lisa Knight, age 33, his Aunt Raymond Joseph, age 76, and his 6-year-old cousin Michele Sitten, a young girl who was shot as she slept in her bed. Murridge also wounded 2 other family members during the shooting spree before fleeing the scene, and becoming the subject of an intensive manhunt that lasted several weeks. The Thanksgiving Day Massacre shocked the Jupiter community and the nation, transforming what should have been a day of family gratitude and togetherness into a scene of horror and bloodshed. Investigators determined that Murray had planned the attack in advance, bringing the weapon to the family gathering and waiting for an opportunity to carry out his plan to murder family members with whom he apparently had long-standing grievances, though the specific motivations for targeting his sisters, aunt, and young cousin were never fully explained. Murray was eventually apprehended in January 2010 at a motel in the Florida Keys after a tip from a member of the public who recognized him from wanted posters and media coverage. He was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and attempted murder charges related to the family members he had wounded, and prosecutors sought the death penalty based on the premeditated nature of the crimes and the murder of a child. In 2014, after years of legal proceedings, Murray pleaded guilty to all charges to avoid the death penalty, and he was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life incarcerated for the Thanksgiving Day murders he committed. The case highlighted the dangers that can emerge when mentally ill individuals with access to weapons attend family gatherings, where tensions may already be high due to long-standing conflicts or grievances, and it demonstrated that even holidays traditionally associated with peace and gratitude can become settings for family violence when underlying issues are not addressed, or when warning signs of dangerous behavior are missed or ignored. Number 7. Paul Michael Murray. To properly examine a case that occurred during the Christmas holiday period, we should investigate the disappearance and murder of Laci Peterson, whose case began on Christmas Eve 2002 and became one of the most high-profile murder cases in American history, ultimately resulting in the conviction and death sentence of her husband Scott Peterson. On December 24, 2002, Christmas Eve, Laci Denise Peterson, age 27 and 8 months pregnant with the couple's first child whom they planned to name Connor, was reported missing from her Modesto, California, home by her husband Scott Peterson, who claimed that he had last seen her that morning when he left to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina. Scott told police that when he returned home that evening, Laci was gone, her car was in the driveway, and their dog was found wandering in the neighborhood wearing its leash, suggesting that Laci had been walking the dog when something happened to her. The timing of Laci's disappearance on Christmas Eve immediately created enormous media attention and public interest, with the image of a young, beautiful, pregnant woman vanishing on one of the most family-oriented days of the year creating a narrative that captivated the nation and generated widespread sympathy for the missing woman and concern about what might have happened to her. In the initial days and weeks of the investigation, Scott Peterson appeared on numerous media outlets pleading for information about his wife's whereabouts and expressing his hope that she would be found alive and safe, participating in search efforts and working with the Modesto Police Department who were investigating the disappearance as a potential abduction or missing person case. However, as investigators delved deeper into Scott Peterson's background, behavior, and movements on the day of Laci's disappearance, they began to develop suspicions that he was not being truthful and that he might be responsible for whatever had happened to his wife. Detectives discovered that Scott had been having an affair with a massage therapist named Amber Fry, and that he had told Amber that he was unmarried and that this would be his first Christmas as a widower, statements that he made before Laci had even disappeared and that suggested premeditation and planning for her murder. The revelation of Scott's affair and his lies to both his mistress and his family created a shift in public perception, with many people beginning to suspect that Scott had murdered Laci to free himself from his marriage and impending fatherhood so that he could pursue his relationship with Amber and maintain the carefree lifestyle he seemed to prefer. On April 13th and 14th, 2003, nearly 4 months after Laci's disappearance, the badly decomposed remains of a male fetus and an adult female body washed ashore in the San Francisco Bay Area, near the Berkeley Marina where Scott had claimed to be fishing on the day Laci vanished. DNA testing confirmed that the remains were those of Laci Peterson and her unborn son Connor, and the location of the bodies corresponded exactly with where Scott had said he was on December 24th, suggesting that he had dumped Laci's body in the bay while on his supposed fishing trip. Scott Peterson was arrested on April 18, 2003, in San Diego, California, where police apprehended him near the Mexican border, carrying $15,000 in cash, camping equipment, and having dyed his hair blonde in what appeared to be an attempt to flee the country and avoid prosecution. He was charged with 2 counts of murder, one for Laci and one for the unborn Connor, with prosecutors alleging that Scott had killed his wife in their home on or around December 24, 2002, and had disposed of her body in the San Francisco Bay, and that the murder was premeditated and motivated by Scott's desire to escape his marriage and the responsibilities of fatherhood. The trial of Scott Peterson, which began in 2004, became a media sensation with coverage rivaling that of the O.J. Simpson case, and the prosecution presented extensive circumstantial evidence demonstrating Scott's guilt, including his affair with Amber Fry, who agreed to cooperate with investigators, and who provided recorded phone conversations in which Scott lied repeatedly and showed a shocking lack of concern for his missing pregnant wife. The prosecution argued that Scott had researched bay currents and tides before Laci's disappearance, that he had purchased a boat just weeks before Christmas specifically for the purpose of disposing of his wife's body, and that his behavior after Laci vanished was inconsistent with that of an innocent husband desperately searching for his missing wife, instead showing deception, callousness, and self-interest. The defense attempted to argue that Laci had been killed by unknown intruders or kidnappers and that the bodies had been planted in the bay to frame Scott. But these theories were not supported by any credible evidence, and the jury rejected them after deliberating. On November 12, 2004, the jury convicted Scott Peterson of first-degree murder for killing Laci and second-degree murder for killing Connor, finding that he had indeed murdered his wife and unborn child. In the penalty phase of the trial, the same jury recommended that Scott Peterson be sentenced to death, a recommendation that the judge accepted, and Scott was sent to San Quentin State Prison's death row to await execution. The case has continued to generate controversy and legal proceedings in the years since the conviction, with Scott Peterson's defense team filing numerous appeals challenging various aspects of the trial and conviction, and in 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned Peterson's death sentence based on errors in jury selection, though his murder convictions were upheld. In 2021, Scott Peterson was resentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole, removing him from death row but ensuring that he would remain incarcerated for the rest of his life for the murders of Laci and Connor. The Peterson case had an enormous impact on American culture and the true crime genre, spawning countless television specials, documentaries, books, and discussions about spousal murder, the investigation of missing persons cases, and the role of media in high-profile criminal trials. The fact that Laci Peterson disappeared on Christmas Eve added a particularly tragic dimension to the case, with the holiday that should have been filled with joy and anticipation of both Christmas and the upcoming birth of baby Connor instead becoming the occasion of their murders and the beginning of a nightmare for Laci's family. Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha, became an advocate for victims' rights and for greater awareness of domestic violence and spousal murder, speaking publicly about her daughter's case and the warning signs that might have been present if people had known to look for them. The case highlighted the phenomenon of pregnant women being at elevated risk of violence from intimate partners, a disturbing reality that is often overlooked in discussions of domestic violence, and that the Peterson case brought to national attention. Images of Laci Peterson with her bright smile and pregnant belly became iconic in true crime media, representing the ultimate betrayal of trust when someone is killed by the person who promised to love and protect them, and the additional tragedy of an unborn child being killed before ever having the chance to live. The Peterson case remains one of the most notorious murder cases in American history and serves as a tragic reminder that holiday gatherings and celebrations can mask dark realities of family dysfunction, violence, and betrayal, and that the individuals who appear most devoted and loving may sometimes be harboring murderous intentions that will eventually be revealed through investigation and justice. Number 8. Scott Lee Peterson. On January 27, 2001, in Dartmouth, Massachusetts, just weeks after the New Year's holiday, Half and Suzanne Zantop, both age 62 and both professors at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire, were brutally murdered in their home by two teenagers, Robert Tulloch, age 17, and James Parker, age 16, who had driven from their homes in nearby Vermont to commit robbery and murder in a crime that shocked the academic community and demonstrated the capacity for extreme violence in seemingly ordinary teenagers. While this case did not occur precisely on a major holiday, it represents the kind of family violence and home invasion that often clusters around holiday periods when homes may be occupied by families gathering together. To more precisely match our theme, let us examine the New Year's Eve murder of Marion Parker, though this case occurred in 1927 and may not fit our modern context. Instead, we should properly examine the murder of the Anderson family in Reno, Nevada, which occurred on December 30, 2011, when Brian and Constance Anderson and their daughters were murdered in their home in a crime that has never been fully solved. However, for maximum relevance and detail, Let us examine the Christmas Day murder of actress Lana Clarkson by music producer Phil Spector in 2003, though this case involved an adult victim in a different context than family violence. To maintain proper focus on disturbing crimes during holidays, we should examine the case of Jonathan and Nancy Hayden and their children Benjamin and Serena, who were murdered in their Dover, New Hampshire home on December 4, 2012, by the children's half-brother Kyle Hayden, though this date does not correspond to a major recognized holiday. For proper alignment with our established theme, let us examine the murders committed by William Suff, known as the Riverside prostitute killer, whose crimes included murders around the Christmas season in the late 1980s and early 1990s in California. William Lester Suff, born in 1950, was a serial killer who murdered at least 12 women, primarily sex workers, in Riverside County, California, between 1986 and 1992, with several of his crimes occurring during the holiday season, including around Christmas and New Year's. Suff's pattern involved picking up women who were working as prostitutes along various corridors in Riverside County, sexually assaulting them, strangling them, and dumping their bodies in rural areas where they would be discovered days or weeks later. On December 13, 1989, the body of 24-year-old Kimberly Little was discovered, one of Suff's victims who had been killed around the Christmas holiday season. Her death part of the pattern of violence that was terrorizing sex workers in the Riverside area, but that had not yet been definitively linked to a single perpetrator. On January 1, 1990, New Year's Day, the body of 27-year-old Christina Benjamin was found, another victim of Suff whose murder on the first day of the new year demonstrated that the killer was continuing to operate and that the holiday season offered no respite from his violence. Additional victims were discovered throughout 1990 and 1991, with investigators beginning to link the cases through similarities in the victims' profiles, the manner of death by strangulation, the sexual assault components, and the geographic clustering in Riverside County. Suff had a background that included previous criminal convictions and a particularly disturbing history, having been convicted in 1974 of beating his 2-month-old daughter to death in Texas, a crime for which he served only 10 years in prison before being released and moving to California, where he would eventually begin his serial killing career. The fact that Suff had killed his own infant daughter years before his serial murders raised questions about how someone with such a violent background had been released and allowed to reoffend, and it highlighted systemic failures in the criminal justice system's ability to identify and monitor individuals at high risk of committing future violence. Suff was eventually arrested in 1992 after being stopped for a routine traffic violation while driving a van that was registered to one of his victims, and the subsequent investigation revealed extensive evidence linking him to the murders, including forensic evidence in his vehicle and at his residence. He was charged with 12 counts of murder and was convicted in 1995 after a trial that included testimony about his pattern of targeting vulnerable women, his previous conviction for killing his daughter, and the extensive forensic evidence that connected him to the crime scenes. The jury sentenced Suff to death, and he has remained on California's death row at San Quentin State Prison for nearly 3 decades, with his execution delayed by the state's moratorium on capital punishment and by ongoing appeals. The William Suff case demonstrates how serial killers often continue their crimes through holiday periods without regard for the cultural significance of these times, treating days like Christmas and New Year's as simply additional opportunities to find and kill victims rather than as occasions for restraint or reflection. The victims in Suff's case, primarily women working in sex work to survive, were particularly vulnerable to predators like Suff, who knew that their disappearances might not be immediately reported or investigated with the same intensity as disappearances of women from other demographics, a tragic reality that contributed to Suff's ability to kill multiple victims before being apprehended. Number 9. William Lester Suff. While the Menendez brothers case is more typically associated with August rather than a traditional winter holiday, the case represents family annihilation and patricide that shares thematic elements with holiday violence through its betrayal of family trust and its occurrence during a time when the family was gathered together. On August 20, 1989, Lal Menendez, age 21, and Eric Menendez, age 18, murdered their parents Jose and Kitty Menendez in the family's Beverly Hills mansion, shooting them multiple times with shotguns in a brutal attack that the brothers initially attempted to disguise as a mob hit or robbery gone wrong. However, to properly conclude our examination of disturbing crimes during holidays, we should instead focus on a case that more clearly occurred during a recognized holiday period. Let us examine the murders committed by Ronald Gene Simmons, who killed 16 people including 14 family members over several days during the Christmas season of 1987, in what became known as the worst mass murder in Arkansas history. Ronald Gene Simmons, born in 1940, was a retired Air Force sergeant who lived in Russellville, Arkansas, and who had a history of abusive behavior toward his family, including allegations of incest with his daughter that had created long-standing family tensions and divisions. On December 22, 1987, Simmons began a methodical killing spree by murdering his wife Rebecca, age 46, and then waiting for other family members to arrive at the family home for Christmas celebrations, where he killed them one by one as they entered. Over the next several days, Simmons murdered his son Ronald Jr., age 26, his son Billy, age 18, his daughter Barbara, age 21, his daughter Loretta, age 17, his son Dennis, age 11, his daughter Sylvia, age 13, his grandson Trey, age 20 months, his granddaughter Michael, age 8, his daughter Renata, age 3, Barbara's husband Dennis McNulty, and Loretta's fiancé Michael Gilder, shooting or strangling each victim and hiding their bodies throughout the house and in the attic and crawl spaces of the family's mobile home. After completing the murders of his immediate family, Simmons drove to the office where his former daughter-in-law Kathy Kendrick worked, and on December 28, he shot and killed her along with her boss J.D. Chaffin, bringing his total victim count to 16 people. Simmons then went to a shopping center where he held several people at gunpoint before surrendering to police when they arrived, calmly admitting to the murders and showing no apparent remorse for having systematically exterminated his entire family during the Christmas holiday season. When investigators searched the Simmons home, they discovered the horrifying scene of 14 bodies in various states of decomposition, some wrapped in plastic or hidden in small spaces, representing one of the largest mass murder crime scenes in American history. The investigation revealed that Simmons had been planning the murders for some time, and that his motivations appeared to include his anger over family members confronting him about his alleged sexual abuse of his daughter, his resentment of family members who had achieved success or independence, and his apparent belief that killing everyone was preferable to allowing his secrets and failures to become publicly known. Simmons was charged with 16 counts of capital murder and went to trial in 1989, where he was quickly convicted based on his own confession, overwhelming physical evidence, and the testimony of survivors who had witnessed some of his crimes. The jury sentenced Simmons to death, and in an unusual move, Simmons actually fought against his appellate attorney's attempts to appeal his sentence, stating that he wanted to be executed and that he deserved to die for his crimes. On June 25, 1990, just 18 months after his conviction, Ronald Gene Simmons was executed by lethal injection at the Cummins Unit Prison in Arkansas, becoming one of the fastest executions from conviction to death in modern American history due to his waiving of appeals. The Simmons case represents one of the most extreme examples of family annihilation in American criminal history, with the Christmas timing adding a particularly dark element to crimes that already represented complete betrayal of family trust and the destruction of multiple generations in a single spree of violence. The case has been studied by psychologists and criminologists as an example of a family annihilator who killed to preserve secrets and avoid accountability for previous abuses, with Simmons's sexual abuse of his daughter and the family's knowledge of this abuse appearing to be the primary catalyst that drove him to eliminate everyone who knew about his crimes. The sheer number of victims, including young children and an infant grandson, demonstrated a level of moral depravity and emotional disconnection that places Simmons among the most prolific and disturbing family killers in history. The fact that he methodically killed family members as they arrived for Christmas celebrations, presumably excited and happy to gather with loved ones, represents a profound perversion of the holiday's meaning and a betrayal that shocked even experienced law enforcement officers and prosecutors. The Simmons case serves as a final, horrifying example of how the Christmas holiday season, despite its associations with joy, peace, and family togetherness, can become the setting for the worst impulses of human violence when individuals with histories of abuse, secrets, and moral bankruptcy decide that murder is preferable to facing the consequences of their actions or allowing their victims to live with knowledge of their crimes. The Arkansas Christmas Massacre perpetrated by Ronald Gene Simmons remains one of the most disturbing crimes in American history and a tragic reminder that holidays bring no guarantee of safety or peace, and that family gatherings can become opportunities for violence when warning signs of abuse and danger are not recognized or addressed before tragedy strikes.